Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conversations on Ageing. Tonight, we're focusing on ageism and human rights of older people. This is the second in what's going to be an annual series of conversations run by the National Ageing Research Institute, where we discuss a topic of the day related to ageing. My name's Professor Bryony Dow, and I am the Director of the National Ageing Research Institute, known as NARI. I'd like to start our webinar this evening by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming to you today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across Australia and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us this evening. I'm going to start with a bit of housekeeping. We will start with a conversation between me and our guest conversationalists, who I'm sure you can't wait to hear from, Geraldine Doogue and Patricia Sparrow, and I'll introduce them shortly. But I'll make sure I'll leave some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them throughout the webinar, I should say, using the Q&A function. And also just letting you know that today's conversation will be recorded and uploaded to our website within a few days, once we've had a moment to edit it, and it'll be on the NARI YouTube. But we will send you all an email with the link to the video. So, like most organisations at the National Ageing Research Institute, we have a strategic plan, and our strategic plan is underpinned by our values. And one of our key values is combating ageism. And actually, of our 6 objectives, one is to promote a realistic picture of older people. So not an unrealistically negative one or a patronisingly positive one. So that's why these conversations, and particularly a conversation focusing on ageism, is so important to us. Our work's also informed by a community advisory group of older people, and we ask them regularly what are the key issues for them, what do they think we should be focusing on, and the number one issue that's emerging recently is their experience of ageism and age discrimination. So what is ageism? I'm just going to give you a definition, being the academic. So according to the late Robert Butler, ageism has 3 components. So that they are stereotyping, so that's characterising all older people as being the same or having certain characteristics, like being bad drivers or being unable to understand technology. Prejudice, so that's having negative feelings associated with ageing and older people. And discrimination, which is really where older people's rights are transgressed by social or regulatory systems that discriminate against them. I think it's the only form of discrimination and stereotyping that still goes largely unchallenged. People still get away with saying someone's a silly old driver, or even, I don't want to work with older people, without anyone really picking that up. And I don't think you'd get away, and you shouldn't get away, with similar comments relating to sex or race. But ageism starts with all of us. We internalise ageism. Jonathan Swift said, everyone wants to live forever, but nobody wants to grow old. And I guess that's because older age is associated with negatives, with ill health, with dying, with loneliness. And this is also reflected in our everyday language. Things that are old or old hat or old fashioned are considered bad things. Things that are new or fresh or young are good things. So what do our conversationalists think about all this? What's the role of the media in combating ageism or promoting ageism? And how can older person advocates like the Council on the Ageing play a role? So I'm now going to introduce Geraldine Doogue, who I'm sure requires no introduction. Geraldine is a renowned Australian journalist and broadcaster. She currently works as a presenter for ABC Radio National Saturday Extra, specialising in foreign policy, regional issues, and agenda-changing conversations. Geraldine has previously worked as a reporter for the West Australian, The Australian, 2UE, Channel 10, and as the presenter-creator of ABC RN's Life Matters, and host of the ABC TV's Nationwide in the 1980s. During her career, Geraldine has received numerous prizes and awards, including a United Nations Media Peace Prize and 2 Penguin Awards. In 2003, Geraldine was recognised with an Officer of the Order of Australia for her distinguished service on issues involving ethics, values, religion, and social change. And in 2018, she was admitted to the Australian Media Hall of Fame. So thank you, Geraldine, for joining us this evening.
Pleasure.
Pat Sparrow is also very well known to us in the ageing and aged care sector. Pat Sparrow is the recently appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Council on the Ageing, or COTA Australia, the peak body for older Australians. Pat's career spans community, disability and aged care, health and advocacy roles. She has experience from the perspective of not-for-profit, public service, advocacy, ministerial office, and most importantly, as a support to her own ageing family members. Pat centres her work on the value of older people. She's worked consistently to improve the choice and control older people have in their own lives, working to reform aged care to fund the individual's care rather than being centred around the provider. She takes a constructive approach to building an inclusive and bright future for older people, and her goal is to eliminate ageism, which should be as socially unacceptable as sexism and racism. So, I'm going to start with the personal. Geraldine, we're all growing older, yet even to ask you about your own experience of ageing still feels slightly insulting. But I'm going to proceed.
You're going to go carry on.
Yeah.
Yes, push on.
Yes. As someone who's approaching older age yourself, what's your experience, personal experience of ageism?
Well, I have to say, I initially, when you asked me to join you, it wasn't as the moderator, it was as the candidate, the ageing candidate. I thought, oh God, right, I've got to that point in life. That's what I thought. I've got to that point, you know? Mm-hmm. And I thought, should I say it, you know? And I thought, yes, I like the time I'm at, and I like these types of conversations, and I think they matter, putting words to things. You know, I think it's a very, it requires introspection, I think. I mean, I think all decent times in life, but they are transition times. And so the more you can put your thoughts down, I think the better you come through. I might add, there's a gorgeous line when you're reading out this sort of CV, which is sort of pertinent. Nicholas Tomlin, who was a fantastic journalist, used to say, after somebody would read out, some sort of vaguely glowing CV, he said, of course, the only qualities necessary for real success in journalism are rat-like cunning, a plausible manner, and a little literary ability. So I come to you with that sort of, sense of self. You don't want to get too carried away. But I will say that I realised when I was thinking about various things, how long would I work? Where did I want to put my energies? I wanted to be relevant. Mm-hmm. I sort of distilled it. I would like to be relevant in some form, not necessarily to receive massive applause, which I think you do need when you're younger, when you're trying to build your profile. I'm not at all cavalier about that, but actually I would like to be a bit relevant, which then means, well, how do I stay relevant? Because you don't just get conferred relevance, at least I don't think you should. Well, it means keeping up. And that is quite, you may make a decision that's not worth it because things are moving very fast. There's a tremendous sense of momentum and change around, and you've got to decide whether you're demoralised by it or whether you're going to keep up with it in some form. It's quite a decision, and I think you've got to work out ever more cleverly how you prioritise. I think you've got to work out what to leave behind. There's a great and terrible line, Lang Hancock, the sort of, developer of WA, take the best and leave the rest. That was about iron ore, which he did do, I might add. But, it's quite a useful thing. Take the best and leave the rest. What fights to have, what fights to avoid.
Yeah.
Honestly, that is so important. I'm sort of stunned by how many people take on fights. I think, look, leave it. It's not part of your particular bailiwick. Leave it. And another very important conclusion I have drawn anyway, two other important conclusions I would say is, in terms of discerning how much you do want to stay working, which could contribute to whether you are relevant, I've come to my own little motto that twice a week, this is when I stop doing the full salaried work, I need to be committed to a deadline that is not my own.
Okay.
In other words, placing some pressure on myself, not me, it's somebody else's pressure, which sometimes gives you the irrits, but I tell you, I think it's critically important. And the other thing is to almost focus and recognise new dawning personality traits, one of which may be that you don't want to play the charm as much as you did. You don't want to play when I say seduce, I mean it in the broader sense of the word. Like when you in building where you grow, you've got to seduce a lot. And you get to the point you think, oh, I'm sick to death of this. Now, that doesn't mean you become a curmudgeon, I hope, but it may mean that you're laying aside some of that earlier traits that got you where you are, and then you have to work out how that plays in. So all of that has been going through my head.
Yeah. So you're having to work harder as an older person in the media to get that, to I guess achieve that relevance that that you're seeking.
Look, you become so much cleverer. You're so much more efficient. You corner cut brilliantly. So I don't think it's a straightforward working harder, but it's certainly, it's a conscious, it's tactical behaviour.
Right.
That's what it is. It's different behaviour. I wouldn't say, it can sometimes feel harder because it is different. And then you sit back and you think, oh, I made that decision so easily. You make decisions far more easily.
Yeah, there's certainly advantages in growing older.
Yeah.
So have you, during the course of your career, I mean, you're a very well-respected commentator on many local and global issues. Have you noticed any significant changes over the years in how we think about older people or our ageist attitudes and so on?
Look, I really love to come to these things full of optimism because I'm quite an optimist. But I actually think that there is still, it's a bit later, the sort of ease of relevance and ease of invitation, I think starts to alter when you get into that 70s, actually. And I think that you have to be very focused and targeted on what it is that you're seeking to contribute. Now, look, I think that's true of quite a lot of younger people as well. There's so much noise around that you have to value add, and you have to be quite ruthless in your assessment of what it is that you're seeking to include that will mean you're worth it. But I certainly, like, in the US and the UK, there's certainly older women on television that just are not here in Australia, just not. I think it's still
pretty... It's that kind of intersection of ageism and the way we value women.
Yes, yes. And I think it's where, the amount of energy that goes into presentation, I think is, you just can't avoid it. And look, I know this, people will hate me saying this, but there are a couple, the nice part of it is it could be intersecting with the extraordinary changes in the media, where there's these days in Australia, certainly, this exceptional need to make sure that we're linked in with the digital generations. And my argument is there's not nearly enough effort go into turning the people of my age into digitally obsessed people, because they're available for it. But there isn't at all the commitment to doing that. It's much more that sense, well, they'll be the next lot, the Gen X's and millennials. So in a way, I can see we're also
almost not seeing them as an audience for digital media.
And look, I think that the really difficult part of this is physical appearance. It can't be completely avoided. And in my observation, the slim older woman has a distinct advantage as an elder. I like elder rather than elderly, over sisters of a different build. Now, look, I hate saying this, but The Economist wrote about it recently, talked about in terms of ruthless, rational positioning and economic advantage, you couldn't be too slim. Now, that is depressing.
Can't be too rich or too slim, I think.
But I think it's true.
Thanks, Geraldine. Pat, I'm just going to go to you now. Again, starting with the personal, would you like to tell us about some of your personal experience of ageism?
Yeah, and I think, I think as you do get older, you do experience it, and probably from both ways. Like we talked about that internal ageism, I certainly know I do that to myself. And I'm getting better now, but I used to be, insanely happy if someone said I looked younger than I actually was. And you get to a point where you think, why would I feel like that? What's wrong with looking the age that I am? So, I still do that to myself. And I will share a story. I've joined a gym recently, and I went along to the gym, and most of the people there joining up were probably 20 years younger. And the conversation went from being, talking about longevity and wellness to talking about anti-aging treatments, at which time in the room they spoke pretty much only to me, that I would be the person who would want the anti-aging treatments. And they were talking about, you can have a well-deserved drink afterwards. And even the drink they chose to ascribe to me was a drink that I'm surprised they didn't say sherry. It wasn't quite like that. There's nothing wrong with sherry, but they made certain assumptions about me based on age. And the poor people, because at the end they came to say, "Are you going to join?" And I said, "Well, I have to ask you if you actually want someone my age as a member." And they're like, "What do you mean?" And I genuinely don't think that they meant to. So, you see things like that, and you see it happen to people that I've got family members who lived overseas for a long time, came back to work as an older person and couldn't get a job for love or money, even though they had fantastic experience and fantastic skills. And you watch people go through that. So you see it in all sorts of ways, every day. Some subtle, some not so subtle, as my gym was not very subtle, but in other ways you see it in a very subtle way. So I think we all see it and experience it, maybe not on a daily basis, but fairly regularly. And you can see it happening to other people.
So as I said earlier at NARI, this is a front and centre issue that's coming up for us amongst our constituents, amongst the people that advise us about the work that we do. How's that playing out at COTA? Are you hearing from your members that ageism and infringement of their rights as an older person is an issue?
Absolutely. And, just like it's your kind of mission, it is our mission too, that we want to see ageism addressed. And a bit like you, Bryony, it's kind of like the last ism to really be talked about seriously. Not that we've got a long way to go in sexism and racism as well, but we don't tend to talk about ageism in the same way. And Australian research actually shows that in the last 5 years, most older people, when we're talking sort of over people in their 50s, they would say they have experienced some form of racism. So it's quite endemic in the way that we work. So we do engage and talk to a lot of older people, and exactly what Geraldine was saying is what they would say to us, is that they do feel that they want to make a contribution, but that people aren't interested in what they've got to say. So they often become a member of COTA or a supporter of COTA or get involved in what we're doing because they feel that it enables them to put forward their view and that it's being listened to. And so that's a role that we take very seriously in trying to address the issues that they're facing. And they talk a lot about wanting to do. The last conversation we had was about running some kind of ageism social media campaign where people talked about the ageism that they experienced and the impact that it had on them, which is a really good idea. So it's a daily conversation for us about how do we actually address ageism. We obviously have some policy positions that we think we could take forward that would start to address it, starting with things like, we need to have a whole of government strategy around aging, and it doesn't sort of live in any one portfolio. It crosses all portfolios, and sometimes that makes it hard to really get traction on an issue because it's not one person's responsibility. So we think there's that work that needs to be done, as well as things like reviewing legislation. And let's undergo a review of legislation and see where all the age discrimination kind of sits. There's the Age Discrimination Act, but then there's a whole range of other acts where you see, ageist things. So I think there's a couple of things around ageism we need to do. One is to talk about it and challenge it, because if you don't recognise that it's an issue and you don't talk about it, nothing will happen. But also to look practically at what are the things that need to change legislatively or in a regulatory sense that would actually mean we'd be starting to defeat some of the ageism that's in the system.
We were talking earlier before everyone joined us about how things have changed over time. Geraldine, you were mentioning how this is a new conversation, and I just wondered if you wanted to talk a bit more about.
Well, look, I must thank the Minister, Martin Butler, talking about this. He gave a very good address, the Hugh Stretton oration, that marvellous thinker from South Australia, at the University of Adelaide on the 27th. And look, I was quite struck by what he was saying. That in fact we haven't had a lot of practice having this conversation that we're having now. And to maybe just slightly forgive ourselves, that he was just saying that population ageing simply wasn't on the radar. During, Hugh Stretton wrote about everything that mattered, but he wouldn't have considered writing about this. And that the first big Australian study of population was commissioned by the Curtin government during World War II, and then been this huge fall in birth rates and immigration during the Depression. And I mean, it is amazing. They projected that our wartime population of 7 million would grow slowly to 8 million by the 1980s and then start to fall. And here we are with this amazing baby boom, and then, the whole 50s immigration. And look where we are now, 26 million, I think it is. And that he's saying that generally older Australians, I'm just reading the material, older Australians weren't living any longer in the 1970s than they had decades earlier. So the older cohort was pretty static in the data, and all these sort of changes in life expectancy that we've come to take for granted, that happened in babies and young people. And so we weren't thinking like this. So maybe, I mean, you'd probably better skilled than I, but maybe we are having maybe we are the leading edge of a conversation that matters. And so that it, and I suppose I found that quite revealing, because I thought, well, maybe we are being invited to consider. And for me, you sort of nominate what's wrong, and you're doing that beautifully, systemic problems, systemic shortfalls. But then to me, the real success is when you start to nominate competence. The next stage is nominating what is flourishing and what good can, so even you asking me to sort of start, I like the age I'm at. I actually like it. I feel more competent than I've felt for years. Now I need to start saying that and showing that. And then we will start to shift some of these models that you're talking about. And
I think too, one of the conversations that we need to have more is about the full diversity of older people, because I mean, whilst you can't make any real generalizations about your health at different stages and your capability and so on, it tends to be that a lot of us are going to have, between 65 and 80, this period in our lives where we do feel very competent, we've got a lot to offer, and generally, or at least the baby boomers, healthy, well-educated, and have a lot to offer. But then maybe when, perhaps at sort of 85 plus, it's a whole different scenario, a whole different story about what ageing might mean at that stage in life. And that's really when we need to start thinking about where you might need some help, some care, those systems and how we make sure they are the most effective that they can be. But I couldn't agree more with you that, yeah, we need to start talking it up instead of talking it down.
I mean, that's one of the problems, isn't it? That older people are all kind of lumped together as if they're a homogenous group. And for Council of the Ageing, we represent people over the age of 50. And some of the things that you might be thinking about and wanting action on when you're sort of, 50 to 70 is different from what you might want when you're in your 80s and your 90s. So, seeing older people as an homogenous group that all want the same things and not embracing the diversity in age, but also we know that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's a different experience. We know for different cultural groups. So actually embracing that diversity is really important.
Actually, can I just come in? There's that new book out by Melissa Doyle and Naima Brown, How to Age Against the Machine. I might add that to me, they look like babies. They're 50-year-olds. But anyway, I take, exactly respect what they're doing. But they said something that was quite worrying or, concerning. They didn't feel they could mimic anybody easily who was aging. They started to look around for people whom they, who that goes back to my idea that maybe we're having this conversation anew. I mean, there could be guests on who'd say, no, ridiculous. There's been all sorts of people, but they didn't feel it. Those, young women very much, in the swim and trying to support each other and so on. They didn't feel that they had to look hard for models. Now, I thought that was quite thought-provoking.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So thinking about those, I guess, older age and stage, Pat, like how do we actually maintain people's rights into that older age and stage? We talk a lot about choice in aged care, but I'm not sure that choice is the same as rights.
No,
and there's a lot of talk at the moment about a rights-based approach to aged care with the Royal Commission. So
the Royal Commission recommended that there be a new Aged Care Act that's based on human rights. And I think you're right. I don't think choice is, don't think choice equals rights. I think that there's partly people having choice, but I think it's much more about people having agency and control as they get older. And I think that the Act is going to be really important because it's that, but it's also about how people treat you when you're in aged care and how they respect you. And we do sadly hear stories in aged care where people perhaps aren't given that kind of respect. There's a concept that I'm sure many of you would be aware of too around dignity of risk and allowing people to have the dignity of risk. One of the things that we do see and that regulation encourages, in fact, is, wrapping older people up in cotton wool and not letting them do some of the things that they may want to do that they need to do for their health and well-being. So I think this Act is a really important development in aged care, and we need to make sure that we get it right. But we also need to have a conversation about what it means for the people who are working in aged care. What does it mean that they will do differently to support an older person than what they do now? And I think through the Commission, we saw stories and unfortunate stories of where people weren't being treated with dignity and respect. And I think that we have to make sure that this notion of an Aged Care Rights Act actually starts to do that, as well as supporting people to have their own agency and dignity of risk. And I think on a broader scale, obviously we're looking, and many of you would be aware of this too, internationally, about a UN convention on the rights of older people. We've got conventions on the rights of a range of different groups, but not on older people. And I know that some people might think that's, just a legislative change, but with a convention it brings accountability and reporting and requirements to invest in addressing ageism that we think would be an important part of really trying to move it along and get focused on rights and what they really mean. Because it's true that we can talk about ageism and we can talk about rights and we can talk about it at a higher principled level, which is really important. But we need to translate that into what does that mean actually changes in legislation in the way that we interact, in the way that an aged care worker, in a residential care home may assist someone getting up in the morning and to have a shower, or going into someone's home. What does it mean that you would do differently? So I think it's at a principle level, but it also has to be at quite a practical level. And I think the Act gives us a chance to do that, but also a strong supporter of a UN convention to try and bring some light in terms of what governments need to do, because we don't act on what we don't measure. So I think it's really important that we start to look at that. And I think the Act and the UN Convention would give us some structure around that to sort of start addressing the issues that people have been experiencing for a long time.
What are your thoughts, Geraldine, on a rights-based approach, on a UN Convention of Human Rights of Older People?
Well, I'm listening with great interest. Look,
because we don't have rights-based approaches to a lot of things in Australia like they do in other countries. So yeah, sorry.
No, and over the years I've been a bit ambivalent about people who believe it'll all be solved by a rights-based approach in international conventions, and I've interviewed many people over the years who've really placed I think, misguided amount of hope in those international conventions, and often a very legalistic approach and a sort of an assumption that local domestic politicians will be affected by it. And in my experience, they're rarely affected by it. Occasionally they can be, but I mean, I can't be against it. I just... I've got a lot of confidence in Australians' ability to tackle things when things are articulated. And look, I suppose the one thing that got me about, the whole political climate around the Royal Commission on Ageing was that all Royal Commissions these days, it seems to me, are exercises in name the guilty man or woman or system. And there's very little curiosity about what works well, which goes to my competence argument. And in fact, things are brought in which then have to be wound back because it's too, the media grabs onto it as massive dysfunction, as it's extraordinary amounts of emotion around. We hear, appalling accounts of, and it's highlighted, and there's usually some sort of very big reaction. And then often they're put in and they have to be wound back. So I don't like a lot of the approach of the modern Royal Commission, I've got to say.
I think it's interesting, and would say that there probably are things that might be an overreach, but I think the Royal Commission did actually look at, what are the models that are working overseas? What sorts of things could we learn from? What could we do differently in terms of delivering services that was useful? Right. And I think there's a little bit of movement in that. We can always do more. And I think to your point about conventions, I agree. I certainly wouldn't be advocating that having a convention or having the Act is going to fix everything, which is why I'm also very focused on what are the practical differences that would mean, and how do you actually support workers or people to understand what the differences are, rather than just keeping it focused on a principle level. But I do think that there is some benefit in both of those things happening, and in trying to name and to report and to measure on those things and look at what changes are needed.
I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat now, because we're getting some interesting questions. So one from Deborah O'Connor, who's the Deputy Director of NARI. She's asking you, Geraldine, if you think men experience ageing in the same way women do, just going to your comment about the appearance being so important for women.
Look, I mean, Sir David Hare was at the Adelaide Festival recently, for, talking, he's 75, I think, wonderful playwright. And he made the point that, just as he felt he was now understanding how to write plays, I would have thought he had a few more, that he could chalk up. So he was, I don't think it's as hard for men. I mean, he came, I think there was, now, I mean, I know this is a sort of a strange juxtaposition, but people were trying terribly hard to get Hilary Mantel out here for years, but she was not a well woman, as you know, and she always did the marvelous online things. And I always felt it was a huge pity that we couldn't have had her out here like we had, David Hare and Ben McIntyre and Fintan O'Toole and so on and so forth, who I suppose they're slightly younger. I think that there is a wider range available to males, and it's been workshopped, and the authority experience is by both them and the people looking on is much wider than it has been thus far for women. Now, it won't always be like that. And so I say, this in itself, what we're doing today is proof, moves things along. And you've got to watch yourself, I think, as a woman growing older, that you don't, because you can find yourself doing comparisons and thinking, well, look how much easier it is for them. It just doesn't help you. I think slowness of speech is a huge thing, male or female. That there's got to be that sense projected very definitely that you have, for both genders, that you're in the swim of this changing world. If you lament, I just do not think that's a wise. I did an interview the other day with a man who's written a book, he's a very good writer actually, worrying out loud about the march of technology. And I said to him, I've made a personal pledge not to worry out loud, to be alert and to sort of see challenges, this goes right to the chat GPT, all sorts of things, but to worry out loud and to lament, oh dear.
Yeah.
I think you can do that if you're 50 and below, not above.
The younger generation and the speed of technology.
It's not a good look, not a good look.
Yeah. But I guess it's one thing for people, and I put all of us in that category, who are in positions of some authority. I guess it must be so much more challenging to have relevance, meaning to age with authority, relevance, whatever. If you don't have those sorts of, that I guess those other powers that we enjoy, I guess.
That's why I say I think it takes introspection. I think it takes. I think it's a, slight death and resurrection moment, if I can quote, marvelous imagery from the Catholic Church. You do have to slightly move from the old to the new. You have to think it through. It's quite an exercise in discernment, actually. And you sort of and look, it can be annoying. You think, oh, bugger that, but it's worth it. It is worth it moving to that. Yeah, I think it's worth it anyway.
I would say too, Bryony, that, we need to sort of guard against othering. And, you've talked about that. I'm really conscious of it in my new role that, I'm turning 60 this year. And so often I need to talk about, older Australians, but I'm also trying to make sure that I'm identifying that way as well, so that I'm not sort of othering and saying we're just talking about older Australians as if that doesn't include me, because it does. And I feel lucky to be aging, and I know that there are people who don't get the opportunity to age, and also trying to change some of the language. I think it's the first intergenerational report that started talking about the tsunami of older people. So whenever we talk about older people, it seems to always be a natural disaster, when actually in fact it's an absolute triumph of better health and better well-being and better medicine. So, I think for me, this whole thing in the new job, I've only been in it for 5 months, is, being really conscious of not othering and embracing and standing with, because I am an older person, and hopefully I'm going to get a lot older.
So I'm going to just pick on the term intergenerational, but take it in a slightly different direction. Ageism applies to younger people as well. And we recently, or not that recently, we did some interviews with older and younger people about their experience of the other generation and of ageism and age discrimination. And we had very young people. So the young people were sort of under 25 and the older people were probably all over 80. And there was a huge amount of empathy between those generations. The younger people couldn't imagine what it was like to be old, but the older people had all been young once, so they could imagine what it was like to be young. And, we've seen the old people's homes for 4-year-olds and so on the television, and there seems to be huge potential for better intergenerational connection as a way of better empathy between the generations, of reducing ageism both ways, really. I'm interested in both your thoughts on that. Pat, from the point of view of aged care, is this an answer? Is this something we should be doing more of? And Geraldine, from the point of view of the media, I mean, what an amazing media portrayal of something really positive in ageing and aged care.
I think intergenerational is really important, and getting to know someone rather than just thinking, oh, that person's an old person, actually getting to know the person, or that person's really young. And I did talk back radio recently, and it was on ageism, and we were talking about older workers, and somebody who was older rang in and started being really ageist about younger people. I was like, oh no, I've got to kind of shut this down, because, they don't turn up on time and they don't listen to anything that's being said. And you go, we've got to sort of understand and make those connections. So I think there is a lot of good intergenerational work, and I'm sure that there's more that can be done, but in aged care. But I think we need to do it, more generally. You see wonderful mentoring happen in the community, big brothers and sisters, and a whole range of things that people are doing that put older and younger people together. And I think that's really, really important. So yeah, I'm very supportive of those intergenerational projects and work. And I know that there are some people I know online, I can see some of the names tonight, who are involved in those intergenerational things. And it's a really important, worthwhile thing to do.
Yes, I was also going to quote again a wonderful line from Mark Butler. I want the young to think older people are not my enemy. They are my parents, my grandparents, and one day that older person will be me. And I want older people to think about the young that once was me. He was quite, he really tackled this intergenerational issue. Look, again, I tell you what, I think it gets again caught up in this amazing revolutionary changes in quite a few workplaces, where it's that middle group who were reasonably paid, I think, in a lot of government outlets, taking redundancy or being asked to take redundancy, and a lot of young people being brought on at very low, much lower rates. That is very hard to watch, That's, you're sitting there. There's no doubt in my mind of very recently, and in some parts of the ABC, for instance, I am hearing people articulate out loud anger about boomers and people who've got mortgages and who look settled and safe. This is in places like Sydney and Melbourne in particular, Brisbane to a lesser extent. Actually, it was a real shock. It happened to me recently, twice in one day, and I don't think I've fully recovered from it. Well, put it this way, it really hit me, and I understood it. And look, it's not deep, but it's there. And why wouldn't it be there? Why wouldn't it be there? We had that. Jeremy Cooper on, who did that marvellous report on superannuation about, the Turnbull government, I think, a very competent man. He went and worked for Challenger. He left the sort of government service and went for Challenger, who do all the, that special retirement. Annuities, thanks. Couldn't get the word. He's come, and he did a very good report recently, and he actually said out loud in a very good interview with me, he said, I don't know why my son isn't out in the street protesting. So it is starting to dawn. It's a new era. It is coming. It is coming, and how we handle this will matter. It will matter.
And we hear all the time from people that we're talking to too, that they do worry about you know, younger people and the world that we're leaving, and the things that sometimes there's anger from the younger people that that a lot of our supporters and members talk about, being concerned about climate change for their children and their grandchildren, being concerned about whether people, you know, younger people are going to be able to afford a house. So I think from older people, there's a growing kind of, it's probably always been there, but certainly a growing kind of talking about the fact that they are worried about making sure that younger people are getting a fair go. Yeah,
I think it's it's an important one to broker well and to make it. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of anger growing among older people that this has happened. That tax settings are such that this has happened.
Yeah, I agree. There's a few questions relating to that, but I think we're covering those topics. I'm just this final question here from David. Are we failing to educate the community about the facts of increasing longevity and the extraordinary opportunities in both prevention and adaptation that increasing longevity is revealing? So are we learning it a lot, but not turning it into informed action by seniors themselves? I just thought that was quite an interesting question and touches on some of the things you talked about earlier.
No, we're not doing that job well enough. Not at all. It's sort of exotic. You know, if somebody does something amazing on Australian Story or whatever, it's an exotic event. Oh my God, aren't they remarkable? I mean, there was that fabulous one last week. Heather Mitchell. Now, I mean, God, it was a fantastic piece about a woman who'd been through a range of setbacks, health and otherwise, and had come back and was probably doing her best work now. And if some of us have seen her in some of the performances, I don't think there's any doubt about that. But we must make it much more systemic and much more of a predictable story. And again, I think there's a great reluctance in the media ever since really the 60s onwards has, you know, if it bleeds, it leads sort of thing. And that's a deep thing, you know, because we're there to notice that which is different from the norm. We're not there to say, oh, tomorrow is going to be a gorgeous autumn day, you know, like today. We're there to say there's a cyclone coming. So that's our logic. But what I've been saying for years is often the stories of competence are as surprising as the stories of incompetence that we've come. So you can make that a first par if you're clever. And you know, similarly with like listing where we're not enclosing the gap, you know, all the things we're not achieving as opposed to what we are achieving in Indigenous. But my God, I will not do it. You know, I'm obsessed with actually presenting stories of growth, which are genuinely first paragraph stories, if you know what I mean. But that's what I think we've got to now take that into the media to answer that question.
So I was going to ask you, what is the role of the media, do you think, in combating ageism and improving that?
Look, storytelling, stories of competence, but not Pollyanna stories, not exotic stories, but just systematically. And look, it will come. It takes a while, you know. As I said, we haven't actually had a lot of experience of this. And people coming through, achieving, you know, gradually. Straight enough, I tell you where I see quite a lot of it is in the Financial Review. So there is a paper, you know, with a very definite constituency. I mean, I think it's the best paper in Australia. And now I get a lot of story ideas. But, you know, it's very interesting. There's a lot of wealthier, older people doing most interesting startups, collaborating with young people. You know, you see absolutely intergenerational collaboration. You see pride in it. You see activity, agency. You see that much more, I would argue to you, in the Fin Review than you see in, say, the Nine papers.
Oh, that's interesting. Or
the Daily Telegraph or the Sun or the Herald Sun.
And I think it's true too that in popular culture we're also starting to see stories of, you know, of older people, and that becoming more of the norm as cinema, and that realise that there's a whole market that they can, you know, appeal to. So in part, the fact that the numbers are getting larger is going to work for changing some of that. But I think, you know, we have to, and our role at CODA is to make sure that the voices are heard. And I like the approach that Geraldine's talking about. We want to talk about the positive things, not just the things that aren't working well. One of the challenges around getting people to think about this is that people don't want to think about being older, and so they don't necessarily want to plan, and they don't necessarily want to know all of the things that they could do. You know, superannuation is a classic example. People don't really start thinking about that till they're in their mid-50s. So there is still awareness, and I did see in one of the comments there is a campaign called Every Age Counts that's doing some great stuff in this space. We do need to sort of keep up that awareness so that people do feel more comfortable talking about ageing and thinking about and planning ageing and making those adaptations, you know, as you age and go along that help you with your longevity and how you can, you know, function in the world.
Indeed. One of the myths around older age is that older people reside in residential aged care. Those of us in the industry know that that's actually a small proportion of older people, about 6% at any one time. And I think you have a 1 in 3 likelihood across your whole life that you may go into residential aged care. And I shouldn't say end up, because I actually don't think it's a bad thing. It's a good thing if that's what you need, and that we're very lucky in Australia that we've got the care that older people might that they might need. But I guess, you know, we do need to think about that part of our lives when we may be going into, I guess, a stage of life where we do need more care. And so I've got a question here from one of my colleagues about how do you manage to maintain your human rights when you're at that stage of your life, when you may have dementia, and there is kind of, I guess, the responsibility for maintaining those rights then starts to rest with other people for maintaining them for you. What her point is just that it's, you know, it's a balance. What, you know, it's a complex issue. Love either of you to comment on that.
Absolutely is. It's a really difficult issue. I do think the disability system has done a better job at rights, and you know, there are issues there where people also need assistance to exercise their rights, and disability has had a rights underpinning all the way through, and I think they tackle it quite differently than we do in aged care. And I think there is a lot to learn from the way that disability has tackled those things. But it is difficult. I think the Rights-Based Act will help. I think the greater education that we're talking about will help. And you know, I think we have to make sure that in that changeover, that everybody who's working with the person with dementia also knows how to interact with the person with dementia, because people with dementia still can tell you what's important to them. And, you know, if you understand and you can work with people, then you can still listen to what they need and what they want to see happen in their lives. So I think there's a range of things that we can do to make that better and help people keep their agency, which they absolutely should be able to do.
How do we get people to think about those times in life and plan for them? You know, when we do tend to want to avoid thinking about a time in life when we might have to depend more on others, and you know, the risks of that. Great question here from Anita. So I love these questions. So what advice would you give your younger self about ageing and how you've aged, and how we get this hopefully positive message out to the population?
Oh gosh, well, look, I do think that the wonderful thing of women's lives anyway, I mean, and somebody said this, a woman who used to be head of programming, Penny Chapman, gave us this, I think she, around about 2000, she said, look, you can go in and out. Life is, there are peaks and troughs and peaks and troughs. Don't panic at the trough. And
Nice.
that I've never forgotten it. And she was proof positive. She was a wonderful producer, actually, and she was proof positive of that. And I remember taking it in. You know how you look back and you think of, you hear a lot of things and things that stuck with you. And it's that classic story. She told a story. She was there enjoying her life as a big commissioner, having been in a production house and so on. And I thought, yeah, I think I'll choose to believe you, you know, as opposed to that terror. But it's, you know, look, staying relevant in something as competitive as the media takes quite a lot of nous, luck, nous, work. And so you do, look, there's got to be enjoyment there too. That's what I'd tell my younger self. And I did enjoy it. And I do think one displays a different visage if you enjoy it. I think that's what I'd tell my younger self.
I think I'd tell myself to embrace every age, that there are great things about every age. And I guess when I was, 15, the fact that I'm turning 60 this year, I would have thought was, life would be over. So I think, it's about embrace every age, because there's great things at every age, and go for it. Go for it at every age.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that we're meant to be super stressed at an older age. I've got a feeling you can be pushed, but not super stressed.
There's a lovely, I think it's a TED talk by Jane Fonda, and she talks about the three, like likening aging to the third act of life.
Right.
So the first act sets the scene, I guess. The second act is more where the conflict and like all the issues are established, and it's all very competitive, and the third age is really where there's more resolution. And and she was saying for older women, particularly older women who are comfortably financially, it's really can be so much the best time in life, because you've no longer got all the challenges that younger women have. And you can enjoy that greater confidence that you're talking about, and sense of self, I suppose, so that it can be actually a wonderful time, particularly for women. Yeah,
absolutely.
I agree completely. That's why I said.
So where I'm getting
yes.
to in this conversation, I'd love to hear your final thought. But that we should be celebrating aging a lot more. Geraldine, let's have some final thoughts from you.
Oh, look, I suppose final thought is that if you're lucky enough to have good health, and the means to not be panicking isn't good. Look, I think it's marvelous. I think there is a genuine wisdom. There's a lowering of the shoulders, and I am thoroughly enjoying being the age I am. So I leave that as my thought.
Thanks. Pat?
Oh, and in line with, embracing every age, and, letting go of the thing about, that I said earlier, that feeling when people said I looked younger, that was great. Be who I am, be the age I am, and be proud of it, I think is really important. But also partly, I guess, in the role that I'm in, but also just as a human, actually understand and acknowledge that not everybody's in as fortunate position as I am as they age. And doing what we can to make sure that for all older people, however they're experiencing it, and obviously I've done a lot of work in aged care, making sure that they are supported and respected so that they can age well is really important to me.
That's a great point, and I think we all have a responsibility in that regard, for sure. All right, well, I'm going to wrap up. I'd like to thank our audience for coming tonight. I'd like to thank Bella Hall, who's in the next room, for backup IT for us. I'd also like to thank Associate Professor Michael Murray, who's the chair of NARI. He sponsored the event this evening. And most of all, I'd like to thank our wonderful panellists. Thank you very much, Geraldine and Pat.
My pleasure.
And we can't have clap symbols from everyone, but you can certainly get a clap from me.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you, Bryony.
Thanks so much.
I've enjoyed it.